The internet was so bad last time that it took like several goes to go live, and then we couldn't end the hangout at the end either. It like wouldn't hang up, and then it kicked me out altogether, and then eventually I got back in and everyone was gone, and then I was able to like end the hangout finally. This is normally the point where people start emailing me and telling me that it's not working. Sometimes they tweet at me too. Okay, it must be working. This is good news. So we'll give people like 1 more minute and then we'll get going.
Cool.
Cool. Thanks, Carol. Carol says it's working. We're good. I have like complete paranoia over Hangouts on Air, and it's been so awful that I just can't imagine ever enjoying using it now. Like when I was trying to set this up, Google Plus kept being like, look, you can use this new version of Google Plus, and I'm like, no, I don't work for you, and now I don't have to do things like that anymore. Okay, awesome. Well, let's get going. So I mean, Chuki is not here because she's giving like, I don't know, 4 talks in a week or something. But we're like super excited to have Camille doing a webinar with us because we're like big fans of Camille. She's been our inspiration on, technically speaking, at least once, maybe more than once. And we have a special guest co-host, Alison, who's also given a bunch of cool keynotes, including in New Zealand, which I'm pretty jealous of. Was it New Zealand or was it Australia?
New Zealand.
Okay, cool. I should know because I lived on one of them, right? I should remember things like that. But yeah, so Camille and I spoke together at the Lead Developer earlier this year, which was super fun, and she gave this amazing keynote and looked super fierce because she was wearing a fabulous Went the Runway dress. But now Camille is, let me get it right, a thinker and raconteur.
The senior thinker.
Senior.
Not just a thinker.
Senior thinker and raconteur.
Right.
And Alison's a software engineer at Dropbox. So Camille, do you want to give us a little bit of information about, like, tell us your, like, high-level thinking on Keynotes? And everybody who's listening, please ask questions. I got 2 on Twitter already. That's not enough to keep us going for an hour, so you need to start asking questions, and we're going to keep reminding you.
All right, so hello, everyone. I have never done a webinar before. I'm very excited to be part of this. So, keynotes. So the first keynote I was ever asked to give was for Bang Bang Con, the very first Bang Bang Con. And I was giving a keynote, and Mike Bernstein was giving the other keynote for the other day. So I was very intimidated because he's like super cool dude, and also the Recurse Center, or they were called Hacker School at the time. Folks are also just very cool people. So I was like, oh man, I've got to bring like my A+ game, and so I really I obsessed quite a bit about what I would say for that, and for almost all of the next sort of 3 or 4 keynotes that I gave, because I think the first few times you do it, it's very scary, because it is different than giving a technical talk, and it's different than giving just like a standalone, let's say like speaking at a meetup or at an event where it's really just like you giving a single talk, because I think there's sort of an expectation, or at least I put this expectation on myself. You're trying to almost set the tone for the event, either set the tone at the beginning or sort of summarize the tone. You're trying to do something that feels like it's a little bit bigger than any one particular very focused area, right? My experience is that really good keynotes, they almost help you see the personality of the conference, right? So whether it's like you're at a very highly technical conference and you have keynotes that are, let me see, how should I say it? Like very deep in sort of technical ideas, but also and given by people who are sort of like recognized experts, but not necessarily like I'm going to walk you through the implementation of this technology. So so a keynotes really speak to the feeling of the conference. And every time I'm asked to give a keynote, and it's really like explicitly like called out as a keynote. I've done talks where people have called them keynotes, but they were like in the middle of the conference, and it was really just an invited talk, and I was happy to do it, but like I wouldn't have called it a keynote talk at all, right? I really consider a keynote to be either like an opener or a closer. Everyone who's at the conference is attending, or who wants to attend the keynote anyway. It's not like in a separate room where there's other things going on really at the same time. And you're trying to capture the spirit of the conference, and you've been asked to speak presumably because people feel like you have a very unique voice in the kinds of things that conference is focusing on, and you have something that will really resonate with the wide audience of the conference, right? Even though that audience may then later split up and go into different tracks and focus on different things. So that was kind of a rambling answer, but...
No, I think that's cool. Like, one thing that I find happening to me is I give what I call like accidental keynotes. Like, people look at who I am and they look at my topic and they're like, we put you to close the day because we thought that would be a great way to finish.
Yeah.
And like, this happened at JSConf.eu, and like, I don't write JavaScript, so I was like super intimidated just to speak at all at JSConf.eu. So I like hid all morning, and then I was like, I'm okay, and then I ventured out for lunch, and then someone was like, oh hey, you're giving the closing keynote, and I was like, what the fuck? Like, I did not know this was happening. And so then I went and hid for a few more hours, and I'm like, is that a keynote? Is that not a keynote? Like, one, you should tell people.
You should tell people.
A lunchtime surprise. Like, that was terrifying. Yeah. And like, yeah. And it's different because like what you're talking about is like coming in being like, oh, how am I gonna wrap it up? Because when you did that post about you're thinking about was it the Strange Loop?
Mm-hmm.
You were like, who are these people? Like, you spent a lot of it talking about who your audience was and like what kind of things that they would be interested in.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think there's there's a few different ways to approach giving talks. Sometimes you're imparting information. You're always imparting information to some extent, but depending on the talk, depending on the audience, depending on the situation, the focus is more or less on imparting information versus entertainment. I think keynotes have to be, to some extent, entertaining. That doesn't mean that, like, you have to be like a barrel of laughs or like making jokes or playing instruments or anything like that, but a keynote should be something that people, like, they're learning, but they're not, like, furiously scribbling notes, right? It's entertaining. The people that tend to give good keynotes, I feel like, really appreciate that, like, the audience is kind of stuck watching them because this is the only thing that's happening right now. And so, you owe it to that audience to get up there and tell them something useful to each and every one of them as much as you can, and if nothing else, at least entertain them in some way. Make them think, make them laugh, make them cry in some cases, right? It really depends on the keynote. Tell them something that they can really take away and feel like they didn't just waste an hour or half an hour or 15 minutes or however long the keynote is being forced to watch you.
Yeah, there's a really interesting difference between the individual talk and the keynote in terms of the information that the listeners have, like you were just mentioning, Camille. So most of the talks that I had given before the New Zealand talk were technical talks in the middle of a program. And with those, it says in the program what I'm going to talk about. And if you want to come, you come. And if you don't, then you don't. And as long as I actually talk about what I said I would talk about, everything's fine. And for the keynote, most of the time, the program doesn't have an abstract, even if you had one ahead of time. So people can't make an informed choice about whether or not they want to listen to you based on the actual content of your talk. It's just based on your name and maybe if they know your background or read your bio and what the organizers have represented about you.
Yeah, totally. Totally. It's very different. And I think, I really enjoy actually having done it a few times. I mean, it's terrifying, for anyone who's on this hangout who, it has spoken but has never really given a keynote or is hoping someday to get there. It is so terrifying. Certainly, like you will get used to it eventually if you do it enough, a little bit. But like it's it feels like a lot of pressure because you're not like just going deep on a technical topic or whatever. You're really trying to like lay out a somewhat of a larger statement that you believe is widely relevant. I think it's fun. My Strange Loop keynote is kind of funny, right? Because that talk was not written as a keynote. It was written as just like a normal slotted talk. It was an invited talk, which is slightly different. So at least it was invited, and generally, even when I'm invited and I'm not invited to give keynotes, I'm just invited to give like a slotted talk. At this point in my career, I'm not usually giving very, very like deep, detailed technical talks because that's just not what I do anymore. So even my slotted talks tend to be a little bit more general than many people's slotted talks. But this one was, would have been a different talk if I had not given it as a keynote. I really had to, I was actually asked kind of last minute to do it as a keynote, so just a week before, maybe not even that, I can't even remember. It was very last minute. One of the keynote speakers had to pull out, and so they asked me, and I was incredibly honored to be asked because it's such a great lineup of people who speak at Strangely, but there's like a million great options. But the only thing I really had to change about the talk was the attitude with which I delivered it, right? So instead of, if I had done it in a slotted section, I probably would have focused more and maybe even spent a little bit more time on some of the very detailed elements of the systems that I presented, just to give, just to an audience that's probably like interested in distributed systems, development, some more really, really refined takeaways. But when I'm talking to a much wider audience that includes distributed systems developers and programming languages enthusiasts and everyone in between, I kept it a little bit higher level and a little bit more philosophical, right? I wanted people to more take away the philosophy of like it kind of doesn't matter whether you're a deep distributed systems developer or not. The point is that having a successful career of building systems, assuming that you are a developer at all, hearing this talk, having a successful career of building systems means understanding the trade-offs you're making within your systems and giving up on this idea that you're ever going to build the perfect system. So yeah.
I don't think that's a message just for distributed systems programmers.
Yeah. Not at all, and that's the point, right? Yeah. But if I didn't
distributed systems, but I got a lot out of that talk because it was very. And I feel like I thought I learned some stuff about distributed systems, but I think I've now forgotten it. But that's okay. I like felt for a moment like I understood something that might be going on. So we have some questions. We're doing pretty well on questions, but do keep asking them. So our first one is, why would speakers aspire to or not give keynotes? So what are the benefits and the drawbacks? And I feel like you've been touching on some of these points. And this is from one of our favorite technically speaking readers. I mean, we have no favorites, but okay, we have like, you know, some favorites. Catherine Wu, K-Wu, yeah.
Cool. So I think that the benefits are that you really get a very wide audience, and if you really want to build like your name as a speaker, it's, you know, it's a feather in your cap, right? It's you get a lot of people come and see you speak, so you have a huge opportunity to impact a lot of people. Keynote speaking arrangements are usually invited, which is nice. That means that usually you are at least compensated for like travel, if you have to travel. Sometimes you even get paid for them, although don't hold your breath on getting paid to speak at tech conferences. Unfortunately, it's fairly, it's fairly uncommon to get paid much more than like a small honorarium at most conferences. So, you know, I think that's the benefits in my mind are, you know, you get a lot of exposure, you know, it's an invited talk, so you have a little bit more, I think, freedom to think about it. I would say the downside would be that you're giving a talk to a lot of people, right? There's a lot of eyes on you. It's really high pressure. If you're not a very comfortable public speaker already, it's really that's tough. That's like, it's terrifying. I mean, I was a very comfortable public speaker when I gave my first keynotes, and it's still like, it was really a scary experience. So, you know, it can be very intimidating if you don't feel like super confident. And, you know, a lot of people are going to see you, and like, unfortunately, we live in a judgmental society, so there's always that.
I do just want to plug Camille's first keynote from Bang Bang Con 2014, which was a particularly great talk, in my opinion.
I think some of it got missed, so the video is only like 2/3 of the talk, but it's, you know, it's a decent, and also I'm rocking back and forth. Anyway, it's still a pretty good video though.
We have another question. So I think you touched on this as well, which is, should you ask to be paid if you're invited to give a keynote? And do you have to wait for invitations? Also from K-Royal.
So to the first part of that, I think it really depends on the conference, and there are some that maybe have some budget available to pay, and many that don't. So for me, the keynote that I gave in New Zealand, they funded my travel, which from San Francisco was a pretty good sum of money. If you look at it on an hourly basis with the number of hours I spent preparing the keynote, I'm not sure that it was a particularly efficient way to go to New Zealand. But it was really great to get that trip and to kind of build a vacation around it and meet a bunch of people down there. So I think there are some cases where you might be able to get paid, but I think that's not terribly common, as Camille mentioned.
Yeah, sadly, you can always ask. And you should, if it is meaningful to you. I actually have a speaker agent now, believe it or not, partly because I'm fun employed. So, you know, I figured, I'll see, you know, if anybody will ever pay me to speak. It has been somewhat rare, but, you know, I've had it has happened a couple of times, and that's awesome, right? Like, you know, it feels great to feel like after many years of work, and you know, as Allison said, writing talks is a lot of hours of work, especially kind of a keynote level talk. It's just a lot of hours of preparation. So I wish more conferences did pay. I think the economics of running conferences has got to be very bizarre. You know, I can't comment on that because I've never done it before. But, you know, definitely, like, I think keynotes should, at least you should be paid for travel if you need to travel. Like, that's, you know, zero, like, if the conference isn't willing to pay you for travel, unless it's like a group of people that you just love, it's maybe for a non-profit type situation, you know, that's very bizarre, right? If they're charging for tickets, you're sort of part of really what people are coming to see. They're selling this conference using your name, especially as a keynote speaker. So, my personal sort of line is like, I have to really want to speak. I will speak at conferences for travel if I think it's a great conference and I'm really happy about it. If it's like local, fine. I have different standards there. But I have to kind of want to do it. And if they're not even paying travel, it's fairly unlikely that I'm gonna pay for that. As for keynotes being invited versus asking, so I think it's interesting. I think a lot of conferences do invite keynotes. Some conferences do. So like O'Reilly conferences are very interesting the way they do keynotes. I've actually been on the committee for the Velocity conference at O'Reilly. What they will do for keynotes, they have certain numbers of them that are like sort of either like they've got some very high-profile speakers that are doing events with O'Reilly. So some of them will be that. Some of them will be some of the sponsors of the conference will get up and talk for 10 minutes about their product or something to sort of get their brand out there. That's how they pay for these conferences. And then some of the keynotes that they will have will actually be sourced from people who applied to speak at the conference, and the committee saw their proposal and they were like, this seems really interesting, or oh, this person, like I've seen a video of them speak somewhere else, they seem really great, and we would love to get them on stage, not just for a standard 45-minute talking slot, but actually for a keynote. So definitely there are conferences that will pull some of their keynote speakers from the people who just apply to speak at the conference at all. And so it's not always just invite only, right? I think you may be surprised by how many conferences find their keynotes not just by inviting them, but actually by like looking at who applied and saying, wow, like this person is really interesting. The topic that they're interested in, we feel like is very broadly applicable, and we would like to have them do a keynote. But hopefully they tell them before they get them on stage. I think JSConf.eu, that was not a cool move.
I mean,
not cool.
Like,
even though Kate is lovely, and she should be giving keynotes left, right, and center. You should tell people that you're actually going to be giving them, as my dad calls it, the plenary spot.
Yeah. I don't know. I'm not very good at email. Maybe I missed something. Maybe I just didn't look at the schedule. It just never occurred to me that I might be in that position. I was like, wow, this conference is going late. But I mean, I don't know. I love the JSConf.eu crew, so this just should not be like a complaint because it was very flattering. I just like did completely freak out and have to go and hide.
For the Kiwi PyCon organizers, it was a combination for me of sort of invite and audition that I did not know about. So they had gotten my name from another person who had done a keynote. Jessica McKellar actually had given them my name when they were looking for future keynote speakers. And then one of the organizers was at PyCon in Montreal in April, and so came to my talk there and saw my talk. And then afterwards said, oh, we liked your talk. Are you interested in coming to New Zealand and giving a keynote at the New Zealand Kiwi PyCon? So there's some like cross-conference auditioning as well.
Yeah, there are a lot. The conference circuit is a very weird circuit, right? There's the O'Reilly group. There's the people who run GoTo and Yao. There's the QCon contingent. As you do a lot of speaking, this is just sort of a general note to people. Like as you do a lot of speaking, you start to realize that conferences are very much like the real world in that like there's a level of people that sort of speak at conferences just because they know people, they've done it before. They're friends with the organizers because the organizers took a chance and like invited them to something or saw them at a conference and they were like, oh, this person's really good. It's a little bit of a weird world.
It is really cool though when you get to the point where like wherever I go and speak, I always like know someone or I'm like connected to them, and so that makes it way, way better. Like when we were hanging out, like Camille and I at the lead dev, that was like so much more fun because like we were together.
Yeah, it was super fun. It is. I mean, and that's part of the reason I think these like conference cliques kind of form is that the speakers like. It can be very intimidating and lonely to be a speaker, especially if you don't know anyone, because you get up on stage, you're very vulnerable, right? It's a very vulnerable experience to get up on stage in front of a bunch of people and say something, because especially if you say anything interesting, somebody's going to disagree with you at some point. And then you are like, everybody knows who you are. You don't know who anybody is. So you're surrounded by people who want to talk to you, who want to ask you questions. Sometimes they want to give you critical feedback. And I think, I think it's just natural that people kind of want to, speakers especially like to do these conferences with people, other speakers who they know, so that they have like safe people to kind of like get away from the crowd with a little bit. And I think that's very natural.
We have so many questions on Twitter. Alison, do you want to ask the question in the Q&A?
Sure.
And then we'll go back to our Twitter questions.
Sure. So this question is from Jesse Davis. And he asks, should any successful keynote be inspirational besides the other qualities you're mentioning, like useful, entertaining, and so on?
I mean, it's awesome if you can. Yes, I think, but never say always, right? Like, I have no doubt there are great keynotes that are basically just hilarious, right? Like James Mickens, actually, his talks are, I'm not sure I would call them inspirational. I mean, they inspire you to want to be funny as he is, because he's like the funniest man in computer science.
There's not a ton of competition, though.
They're just amazing. They're just like they're a virtuoso performance of sort of computer science comedy, and that's kind of cool, right? Like I think a good keynote is just, I really think that what you want to do is you want to like people to kind of remember you, whether that's because you were really entertaining, you were really funny, you were really inspirational, you taught them something really deep, like whatever, but I don't think it has to be inspirational, even though I think definitely keynotes tend to move in that direction, because if you're going to have this big audience, it's great to take advantage of that audience by really trying to inspire them to do something.
Yeah, I think inspiring is one of a couple of different ways you can go that is likely to be relevant to a lot of people. So if you're able to inspire everyone in the room, that's great. You're probably more likely to do that than to teach everyone in the room something technical, for example. I think it also can be tricky to keep it away from platitudes if you're trying to be inspirational. Like, true inspiration is really hard to do. And I would not feel confident that I could get up and give an inspiring keynote, whereas I do believe I can get up and give one that's interesting and informative and relevant to people's lives.
That's cool. Okay, so our next question from Ian is, what's your favorite keynote that you've seen or given, and what makes them good as an opener or a closer? So obviously I have to say Camille's keynote at the lead developer, because her dress was fabulous, and also because it was this kind of slightly different view on what it means to build a career in computing that I think is different from kind of a lot of the stuff we hear day to day. And my friend Hillary Mason, she gave a keynote at Beyond the Code, and then she gave like a kind of slightly different version of it that she'd built on at Grace Hopper. And that was just like amazing. It was so amazing. And I think and she as well kind of took this kind of different angle on what it means to like be kind of work in the industry, and she like approached it from 3 angles of like data science and entrepreneurialism, and it was just really, really cool. How about y'all?
It's a tough question. I'm drawing a blank, not because I haven't seen some great keynotes, but because I am really bad at I'm really bad at remembering keynotes, and I have to embarrassingly admit that I am one of those people that tends to skip keynotes because I'm lazy and I like to sleep in. And so like often I find myself at conferences and I won't go to the keynote because it's in the morning. So that's actually like the weird like downside of the keynote, is you've got people like me who are like lazy and they skip a lot of the keynotes. I would have to think about it, but I mean, Hillary gives great keynotes. I've seen Harper Reed give some really fantastic keynotes. I think what I tend to see with people who give really fantastic keynotes they're just such polished speakers, a lot of them, that they just entertain and delight with their keynote talks, and you know, which is not to say that they like teach you that much, right? I actually think it's kind of rare to see a keynote where you really feel like, wow, I kind of learned something from that. Actually, a really good keynote was Mike Bernstein's keynote that he did for Bang Bang. The same year that I gave a keynote one day and he gave a keynote the other day. I think he gave his keynote first, and it was really inspiring because like Mike and I are, I think he's awesome. I think he likes me. I don't know. He's way cooler than I am. And his keynote was like intimidating for me to watch because it was, it was like this beautiful keynote about the power of obsession, and he really told a beautiful story. And Mike is such an interesting guy because he's got this amazing background of being a musician and being a writer, and he's just like this freaking Renaissance man of a human being. And I am not that. Like, I am not that at all. And I think it was awesome to see his keynote, but also to feel about myself like, okay, I am so glad that he gave this amazing keynote, and it really inspired me. And I gave a keynote on like kind of the same general theme of like, learning and growing as a human, but about someone that's like me. I'm very different than Mike, and so my experiences, and it was cool to like have that almost accidental yin and yang of keynotes. That was a really good one actually. Now that I take a moment to remember.
Yeah, absolutely. The other person who comes to mind for me is Kyle Kingsbury, AFER. So he does a really nice job of having much more opinionated and like technically deep keynotes that still, I think, are accessible to folks.
Mm-hmm.
We have so many questions. I'm always like, every webinar I'm complaining because we don't get enough questions, and I see that Twitter is the answer because people seem to much prefer asking their questions on Twitter. So yay, keep it up. You'll tweet at me, tweet at TechSpeak Digest. If you hate the Q&A module, I don't, like it's Google Hangouts, what can we do? So next question. Do you get to decide what to talk about, or does the conference guide you?
I mean, you generally the conference has a theme, and if you were to get up and talk about puppies, and that was all you talked about, you might be really entertaining, but people would definitely wonder like, why are you talking about puppies?
What about raccoons, though?
What?
What about raccoons, though? What if you just
raccoons? You have proven that raccoons belong everywhere. They always fit in. They have little human hands. I think like the nice thing about keynotes is, as I think we've said earlier, a lot of times you don't have the abstract, right? You kind of give them a title. Sometimes they'll suggest like, oh, we might want to hear something about this. I've actually been asked to give keynotes, and I've been asked for a very specific topic. So like at the lead developer in London, the one that Kate and I spoke at, they actually asked me to give an extended version of a keynote that I had given before, and that was actually kind of nice because it was like, all right, like I've already written this talk, I extended it for that audience, but they really knew what they wanted from me. That was kind of useful. Sometimes an open-ended keynote can be very intimidating, especially if you feel a little bit of the imposter syndrome of like I spoke at Strata in EU in Barcelona last year, and I was like, I mean, I do know some things about data and data science and engineering, but like I'm not really like a big data person these days, and it felt very intimidating to like have this wide open space of like, oh my gosh, I'm going to get up on a keynote stage, but came up with something, and I'm happy with how that talk turned out.
That was a great talk. That was the one that you did about the Wizard of Oz, right?
Yeah, that was my Wizard of Oz talk. Yeah.
No, so this is where we reveal that I've been stalking all Camille's talks about.
I am apparently available on the internet in video form.
Yeah, I mean, what's that like? Who knew? And that question, by the way, was from Alice. Thanks, Alice.
Just to chime in, I think the intimidation factor is very real there. And for my keynote with in PyCon New Zealand, I went back and forth with the organizers a little bit, saying, "Oh, you invited me to give this keynote. Why? What were you hoping to get out of that? And what in my work was particularly interesting to you?" And they gave me some answers to that, and the sort of space of what Python programmers are interested in is still pretty broad. So I asked if they had suggestions for a keynote topic, which they helpfully gave, and then I ignored because I felt that it wasn't a good fit with my work. But I think very often it's quite a broad range of possibilities.
That's cool. Next question. Maret, I'm so sorry if I'm mispronouncing your name. If you send me clear instructions, I will get it better for your next question. So, have you compared being paid with other keynotes in the same conference? I hear that we should do more of that.
Being paid, did you say?
Well, I guess like I'm thinking this is like, oh, I didn't get paid, so did you get paid? Like, I've had these conversations before, and like for me, when I had that conversation, it was like I had a really hard time getting like reasonable travel covered, and my friend was like, oh, I know where that was. Next time, I'll negotiate for you.
I mean, like I said, I've really only been paid a couple of times. You know, there is a lot of value to me. Sorry, I have a cat that's going to come bother me right now. This is Larry. There is a lot of value to me, especially there was a lot of value for me when I was working for Rent the Runway to be able to give keynotes and to just like get both my personal brand as well as the Rent the Runway brand out there in the tech community. And, you know, as much as like I hate the fact that that limits the ability for some people to, you know, to give talks because not everybody can afford the time for travel and, you know, to take off work, I do think there is something to be said for like you are getting value beyond the, you know, you are getting some value for exposure when you can get out there and give keynote talks. I don't, you know, I think it's fair to ask people if they are getting paid. I would probably be too much of an American / whatever to ask people just because, unless I was really good friends with them, just because that's like very, I don't know, you know, we don't talk about money, so.
Yeah.
But I don't think it's, I mean, I think it's a good idea.
More about money though. Like I do agree with that, but like I'm like nervous about starting. But I think to your point on that, there's a big difference between like your work is happy to give you the time to do it, and like one thing that we hear quite a lot is people who are taking vacation days to go and speak.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, my other rule, my personal rule of thumb, to be quite honest, is like if it's a general purpose, like if it's a conference that is not really, it's not affiliated with like a product. Like for example, if I'm going to speak for a company who is hosting a conference and a lot of that conference is focused on their product. But let's say I was speaking at the Amazon conference, right? I would probably ask more aggressively to get paid there than I would speaking at a conference that's a little bit more of like a general purpose, you know, frankly like a PyCon or something like that, just because like I think those are a little bit different communities. I think in one of them there's a company really building a brand. And in another of them, it's a lot more about just the wider developer community. So that's just my personal sense.
We have someone on Twitter, by the way, who's very impressed that your speaker agency also represents bell hooks and Mitt Romney.
Well, I can't take any credit for that. They probably do. They probably do better with Mitt than they do with me.
Camille, you're kind of a big deal. Okay, we have another question from Alice again. Thank you, Alice. Which is, how do you plan out longer content?
Allison, you want to start?
Sure. So I guess the first thing that I would recommend is reading Camille's blog post on her process. That I thought was really interesting. So for me personally, I had a lot of iterations of planning on this, and I had note cards spread out over my kitchen table for weeks and was rearranging them and all that sort of thing. For actually delivering talks, I script them out completely ahead of time, and then I have them more or less memorized by the time I give it. So I find that usually if I'm giving a talk, at least once in the 40-minute slot, my mind will go completely blank. And so if I can fall back to my notes and know exactly where I am, I don't miss a beat. So yeah, as much prep as possible is my answer to that. And then there's also I try to get a lot of early feedback, so try to have conversations with friends about the topic and see what they're interested in talking about, see where they ask questions, see where they get bored, and have that conversation pretty casually in early stages, just to kind of narrow the field of what could be interesting to people.
Yeah. Yeah, so I have a long blog post on Medium that is about my writing process for writing talks. So a lot of the details are in there. I do a lot of breaking down into 3 parts and subparts and keeping that kind of thing in mind. I do not write out full scripts for my talks. I write a lot of speaker notes. In fact, enough speaker notes that it annoys some AV staff at conferences because they're like, oh, you have a lot of speaker notes, so we had to do special things with them. So I have my apologies to all of the AV staff at conferences. I do write speaker notes, but sometimes there probably are some talks of mine up with the speaker notes that you could look at, and they're like, fragments of sentences, words that, I want to be sure words that are sort of trigger words. I do rehearse a lot. So, for a longer talk, I think the trick is not making it boring, which is sometimes when you're given a long time, you want to put too much content into it. You want to put too much detail. You sort of lose the essence of the message in the middle because you're kind of rambling. You're like, oh, and here's these details about this, and then you sort of go into this rabbit hole of detail. So I do think that having some kind of a structure for your talks if you're giving a longer talk, is really valuable for keeping you from going too far into those rabbit holes. And then I do rehearse. I do a lot of rehearsal. I stand up in my apartment and deliver those talks over and over and over and over and over and over and over again. I don't memorize them. It's never quite the same because I feel it's just not the way I do it. Right? It's like nothing wrong with memorizing them. I think people who write scripts, they may very well get better talks than me, to be quite honest. But part of my thing is I really want to be watching the audience and seeing the kinds of things that they are responding to. And frankly, I also don't memorize them because I have inspirations coming into my talks all the way up until the minute that I give them. So my Strange Loop keynote, I even tell a story about a conversation I had with someone the day before, where I mentioned to him what I was going to be speaking about, and he gave me this really great story about, going through the Israeli army boot camp twice. And it was just it was such a good story that I felt like it needed to be a little bit of part of the talk to keep people, it almost keeps me from turning it into a very formulaic thing. For me, it's very much it's a one-sided discussion with the audience, but it's a little bit of a discussion. And I totally agree with Allison. I spend a lot of time talking to my friends about what they think is interesting. I talk to friends on Twitter. I talk to friends, kind of everywhere, just to help me get some focus for ideas of what people really resonate with.
Yeah, and to your point about incorporating stories that happened recently and that sort of thing, we were discussing earlier that for a keynote, it's really nice to try to capture the spirit of the conference or kind of develop the spirit of the conference or set the tone for it. And so I think saying here is the way that these 3 things that I saw yesterday fit together in the objective of what we're trying to do here in this conference. I think that can be a really strong keynote. It's difficult to do. Requires that you pay a lot of attention and contextual attention to the conference, the part of it that happens before your keynote, but it can be great if it works.
Yeah. I think it's a really nice way to be no, I'm here and I'm talking, but I'm also in the audience. And a way to position yourself and kind of have a shared experience with the people watching your talk. Cool. So more questions. Should we take another Twitter question, and then Allison, maybe you can ask the question in our QA module, because we have another question in our. No, wait, we don't have a new question. I have no idea what I'm doing. All right, we're all Twitter this evening. Asking us questions on Twitter. So from Moret, I did not get instructions on how to pronounce your name correctly, so I hope I'm getting it right. I'm sorry if I'm not. Do you suggest just waiting to be invited for keynotes, or actively contacting organizers? Also, I'm very excited for this question because like we're doing our anniversary right now, which is super exciting because we've been going for a year. And so we have T-shirts, which are cool, and they're purple because purple is wonderful. So we're asking people to set their speaking goals, and I'm like, one of my speaking goals is to give a keynote that is not like a surprise keynote where someone says, you know, surprise! But where, you know, it's like, hey, Kate, we would like you to keynote this conference, and then, you know, I go and I know that it's happening, and then I give a keynote, and, you know, it's probably about raccoons. I don't want to spoil it too much, but, so yeah.
I mean, I've never asked to give a keynote, so I don't think there's anything wrong with saying, like, especially, you know, look, if you, for example, if you are applying to speak at a conference, for example, you're answering a CFP, I think it's perfectly fine to say, like, hey, I have this topic in mind, and by the way, I would totally love to give this or something related to it as a keynote. Why not, right? Like, why not put it into people's minds that you're interested and open to that idea? I don't know what will come of it, but certainly can't hurt to raise your hand.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think there's also a lot to be said for sort of the intermediate between waiting to be asked and asking conference organizers, which is to work your network. And if you have friends of friends who organize conferences, which if you're on this podcast, I'm sure you do, make sure that your friends know that you're interested in keynote slots. So like, oh, this is the kind of thing that I would love to give. I would love to talk about, you know, this topic. Here's my blog post on it. Here's my related talk, those sorts of things.
Great advice. I will totally take it. By the way, everyone, I'm open to giving a keynote, possibly about raccoons. All right, next question from Carol. What do you think can be done to encourage and support more women with technical strength to give keynotes? And also she says the three of us are awesome, which, you know, Carol, thank you. I like you too.
I mean, honestly, I think hold your conference organizers accountable. There is no shortage of women who are great speakers in this day and age. If you see a conference that is all men in keynotes, like, ask them why, right? If you're applying, you know, if you're thinking of going to attend a conference, or, you know, if you've applied to speak at a conference and you see that it's announced and it's all men, like, I think it's fair to sort of say, like, look, I'm really, like, it's weird that I'm a woman, I'm interested in going to this conference, I'm interested in speaking at this conference. Are you really telling me there are no women qualified to be up on the keynote stage right now? You're not looking, if that's the case. I mean, most of the conferences I speak at have better keynote ballots, partly because I'm speaking there, but also, I mean, like, I think a lot of conference organizers have wised up to the fact that, like, it's just not cool to be lazy about diversity when it comes to who's speaking at your conferences. What I hope, though, will not happen also is that, like, it won't just be the same 3 or 4 women giving the keynotes everywhere, right? Like, I can't give every keynote. Allison can't give every keynote. You know, lots and lots more. There should just be more diversity in general, not just of, like, gender or race, but, like, actually, like, just different people also keynoting these conferences. And I think, you know, I think that's a little tough because obviously conference organizers are taking a risk when they ask someone who they don't know to give a keynote, because, you know, a boring keynote can be, like, it's kind of a bummer, right? But I still think, like, there's just no excuse in this day and age not to have some diversity in your keynote slots.
Allison, do you have anything to add?
I totally agree with that, and I think the point about holding conference organizers accountable is really important, both for gender diversity and racial diversity and other kinds of diversity in keynote slots, and particularly important for, you know, those of us who are not racial minorities or not marginalized in other ways to be advocating for folks who are, or to be out there saying, hey, it's great that, you know, I'm invited to this conference, but it's awfully white in here. You know, what are you doing about that in the future?
Yeah, one thing I've been seeing this year is, like, a lot of women being invited to give kind of keynotes or, like, plenary slots, and they're, like, diversity focused. And You know, like I think in some ways it's cool that we're having these conversations, but I will say for like pretty much every woman I know who does some kind of like diversity work or inclusion work, like that's often the least interesting stuff that she does.
Yeah.
Well, on that depressing note, we can move on to another question. Do you have any tips for keeping the audience engaged in a sometimes deadly post-keynote Q&A? I like to just walk off the stage personally and just be like, we're done here. But, you know, not every conference organizer likes you to do that, you know, so.
Yeah.
Go ahead, yeah.
Get questions. So the first talk that I gave, the first technical talk I gave got maybe 2 questions. And so I've tried to be really thoughtful about how to draw out questions. And there's a couple different strategies that I try to use. One of them is to actually point to, is like say a question and then refuse to answer it during the talk. So if I say, oh, there's this interesting detail about XYZ, which I don't have time to talk about now, but we can talk about that during the Q&A if people are interested. And then in some cases, that is like the last thing that I say before the Q&A. Or when I switch to Q&A, I'll invite questions. I try to do that in a way that assumes that there are questions. So instead of saying, are there any questions, you say, what are your questions? And then if there aren't questions, I provide some questions. So I'll say, we can talk about why the disassembler module is present in Python source code in the first place, or things that I know the answers to and would be interesting to fill the next 5 minutes. And usually that kind of gets things going a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, I actually kind of feel like the Q&A portion should really be pushed onto the organizers. The organizers of the conference, like, look, for me, when I give a keynote, I do not want to do Q&A because I don't feel like I feel like doing Q&A after a keynote, like it kind of distracts from the message in a way. But in normal talks, like Q&A can be useful, right? If there are like burning questions, I love this idea of like lay questions out there for people to find. That's like a brilliant, Allison. But I also feel like like the conference organizers sometimes I think don't really think very thoughtfully about how should Q&A work. Like, are we going to have mics that people line up behind? Are we going to take them via like a chat feed somewhere, right? And I'm actually kind of a fan of like a sort of moderated chat feed Q&A at this point because I think that you really just people ask like obnoxious questions sometimes in Q&A, and I think that can just a bad question can kind of derail a Q&A in a really unproductive way. So my hope is that conference organizers are going to continue to evolve the way that they approach Q&A. And when you're talking about large audiences, so after keynotes or just talks where you've got like a really large audience, like Kraft did a really good job of this. I spoke at Kraft in Budapest last year, and I'm going back this year, and they actually have like a Q&A sort of text thing where people can like ask questions and vote them up and down, but there are moderators also. So like if you ask something that's just like, I had my friends asking joke questions while I was speaking, right? Like, which, silly of them, right? But, it's nice that you can sort of have a little bit of control over not just what are the most upvoted questions, but what are the ones that actually feel like they're realistic and relevant as opposed to just somebody's hobby horse of like, it's not a question, it's a statement. And what do you expect me to respond to that?
Yeah, the larger the audience, the more important the moderation is. Absolutely.
We've run out of questions.
Perfect timing.
Yeah, I mean, we are kind of getting to the end. I mean, I guess we could make some questions up. Like, Allison, did you prepare a question that, you seem to have thought a lot about getting questions, so I'm going to put you on here.
So something we touched on earlier but haven't actually discussed is imposter syndrome around keynotes in particular. Camille, you mentioned that in the context of BangBangCon and then went on to give a really awesome keynote. Can you kind of say more about your process for dealing with imposter syndrome?
I mean, my process for dealing with why me is always just, well, they asked, powering ahead. There's no way out but through. That's true of many things in this life, but it's terrifying, and frankly, like, I guess there's that element, and then there's the like. I think what imposter syndrome, whether or not it's imposter syndrome, whatever, but I feel what that insecurity does for me is it really makes me want to resonate with the audience even more. It really makes me care a lot more about who is this audience, right? Like I'm feeling imposter syndrome because I feel like I am different from the audience in some way, right? In the case of Bang Bang, for example, like I'm not one of those like self-directed learner types that, like is a tinkerer and like has all these different side projects and, like that's just not my style. And, my stereotype of many of the folks that do that kind of thing is that they are more in that way. That's not entirely true. Of course, that's just my like insecure stereotype. They're all super cool people that have all these cool projects and these little things that they're learning and they're doing, and I'm just this boring manager at this point in my career. But I think that, like thinking back, part of the process of writing that talk was really thinking back on like, when I was, in my like mid-20s, right, which a lot of that audience kind of was at the time, or when I was like in the early stages of my career and thinking about it and having challenges that I think a lot of people have, how did I get through it? Like, what did I learn to get through it? And so trying to give them, like trying to really understand where they're coming from and give them that perspective, right? So Strata was the same way, right? Like I don't really consider myself to be like super in deep exactly with people whose everyday job is doing data science, big data stuff anymore. But I totally, on the other hand, like understand the challenge that those teams can have with, how do you work with engineering? How do you work with product? How do you successfully integrate yourself into the complexities of an organization that, may have, that where you may not like feel fully like everybody around you. So I do think that like you can turn it to your advantage by putting yourself in the shoes of the people that you're speaking to, and everybody has things in common, right? We all have common threads across our careers, across our talents. If we, so just finding those common threads and speaking to them.
Amazing. Well, we are going to finish on time, which is probably good because we like started on time, because Hangouts for once did not make my life too miserable. So shout out to, Google Hangouts for being a vaguely, semi-usable fourth time around piece of software. Congratulations. And thank you so much for Camille to joining us. I think I mixed up some words there. It's late here in Europe. You were fabulous as ever. And Alison, thank you so much for joining us too. Thanks to everybody who asked us really great questions. Just a reminder, it's our anniversary. We're celebrating by encouraging people to set their speaking goals. You can get one of our t-shirts. They're also in gray, not only in purple. Yeah, but you're running out of time to kind of set your speaking goals for next year and participate in our mentoring program. So if you want, someone great to give you a pep talk for an hour or to kind of ask questions of, like, it's a really good opportunity to have someone really cool to speak to. So, and I think that's everything. We'll send out the next edition on Tuesday, and thank you everyone for joining us. Bye.
Thank you.